Hi all and welcome. My name's David Watts and I'm here with my colleague Martin Crammond, who will be helping deliver this session. We'll be delivering it together, but this is on part of For Working Well Together. Just a brief history. Working Well Together, Dave Carney, our boss, is the chair for Working Well Together in the North East, and it was set up in 1998 by the Construction Industry Advisory Committee, which recognised that the construction industry itself needed to do more to improve the health and safety and performance, among a lot of the smaller construction businesses who weren't necessarily getting the help and getting the information that they needed. It was set up as a joint industry HSA initiative to help this, and it's reflected in the motto, help from the industry for the industry. Dave can't be here with us today as he's away from work today. However, he's asked us to just give a brief introduction on his behalf. Since Working Well Together was set up, more than 50,000 people have attended events. That was in person as well. However, the last year and a half or so, we've had to do it slightly differently. So we hope you find these as interesting. We hope you find it useful. It is a bit strange for us as well, and I'll be honest, I don't mind speaking in front of people. However, sitting and speaking to a computer screen can be a bit difficult sometimes. But hope you find it, hope the technology works, and hope you find it useful. If anybody wants to be on the distribution list, contact Dave Carney. His email address is dave@carneyconsultancy.co.uk, or Debbie Flynn from the HSE, whose email address is debbie.flynn@hse.gov.uk. These sessions are typically well attended, and they've got groups across the United Kingdom, in England, Scotland, and Wales. But hopefully, as COVID restrictions are lifted, there will be more events organised. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Martin Crammond, who will deliver the first initial part of the seminar. Then I'll come back and I'll do a bit of a case study, but I'll also talk about how you can manage it, how you can continue to comply and manage vibration within your company. So I'll be passing on to my colleague now, who will speak, and he'll introduce himself as well.
Yes, good afternoon all. Martin Crammond here. What I'm going to be going through is what is hand-on vibration syndrome and what the health effects are associated. Look a little bit on health surveillance and vibration record keeping, how we can go about that from a practical perspective. We also talk about or discuss when it is RIDDOR reportable, under what circumstances, and how to manage hand-on vibration syndrome in your company. Because as you can imagine, from HSE's perspective, safety, yes, everyone can identify safety. However, the health implications of a lot of the things we undertake on a day-to-day basis in construction and other UK industries, it's quite varied. So we will look at that in a bit more detail. As David said earlier, then he'll jump in with a bit of a case study on RIDDOR and what the HSE generally look for when it comes to an investigation. So, first one, what are the health effects? So, hand-on vibration syndrome, I'm sure everyone's heard of it. It's HAVS. It's transmitted in work as hands and arms. This can come from use of handheld power tools, such as your grinders and road breakers, just to name a few, or by whole materials being worked by hand-fed machines, such as pedestal grinders. Now, employees' hands are regularly exposed to vibration, may expose. Are you all right? Yeah. May exposed to vibration, may suffer from symptoms in the hands and arms. These usually, not always, include symptoms such as neurological, vascular, and musculoskeletal disorders. However, just to touch on neurological, so numbness and tingling of fingers, reduced sense of touch, temperature, pain perception potentially. Symptoms lasting longer than 20 minutes after your vibration exposure are likely to be long-lasting effects. So again, key requirement there. These effects can make it difficult to feel, handle small objects, work with small objects, find intricate detail. The vascular, what we're looking at from a perspective from a vascular, is the temporary reduction in blood circulation within the fingers, so that blanching effect. This often is reverted to as vibration white finger. Your fingers feel slightly numb when blanched. As the blood circulation returns to normal, you generally get that sort of feeling of throbbing, red symptoms, and very painful. Although vibration does cause, I guess, hand-on vibration syndrome, it usually does not bring on the white finger attacks. The main trigger is exposure to the cold. So making sure from a control measure that our hands are covered up, I guess, making sure we've got that blood flow there. From a musculoskeletal perspective, what we're touching on is joint pain. People that suffer from hand-on vibration syndrome do often complain about this joint pain, the stiffness in the hand, and a reduced strength of grip, but not also a reduced strength of grip, not knowing how hard somebody is actually gripping onto something, again, which could be a big risk. So what we then look at here is health surveillance. So what is health surveillance? Again, as it states up on this slide, health surveillance is a program of systematic health checks to identify early signs and symptoms of the disease and how to allow action to be taken to prevent its progression, because ultimately that's the whole purpose of it. To identify anyone exposed or about to be exposed to hand-on vibration who may be at particular risk. Now you may ask the question, what is particular risk? Ultimately, it's when people or employees, should we say, have existing HAVS, hand-on vibration syndrome, or other diseases of the hands, arms, wrists, and or shoulders. Or employees with diseases affecting blood circulation, or nerve disorders affecting the hands or arms, such as carpal tunnel syndrome. Identify any vibration-related diseases at an early stage and employees regularly exposed to hand-on vibration. The earlier we identify it, ultimately, the better it is for us to control and manage. To help you prevent disease progression and eventually disability, as we mentioned earlier. Help people stay in work and check the effectiveness of your vibration control measures. Again, key requirement there. If you're doing your health surveillance as required, you'll be able to identify if your control measures are working as they should be, as per your company policies and procedures. So again, when must it be provided? Appropriate health surveillance must be provided for vibration exposed employees who are likely to be regular exposed at or above the exposure action value of 2.5, or likely to be exposed occasionally or above the exposure action value, and where the risk assessment identifies the frequency and severity of exposure may pose a risk to health, or at a particular risk, even if the exposure and current job is below the exposure action value. Now, this is kind of split up in varied tiers, if you like. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, we've got tier 1 to 5. I'll just give you a quick run through of what each of those are, if you like. So that initial assessment is a short questionnaire. It's potentially, if people are moving into a new job, it's going to give you an identification if somebody's already suffering from sort of hand-on vibration syndrome or carpal tunnel. You then undertake your annual screening. So again, carried out once a year to check whether you need to be referred to a tier 3 potentially, or if your control measures seem to be working. Your tier 3 is a more in-depth assessment. It's generally carried out by an occupational health professional. And again, this is where you go through a thorough process, and they may give you some recommendations on what you should be doing or carrying out as an individual and or company. Tier 4 is your formal diagnosis, and again, it's carried out by a doctor with appropriate expertise in the field. The doctor will confirm or amend any previous advice given, including fitness for work. As a company, we should act on any recommendations or restrictions made by the doctor. And finally, this tier 5, you have this optional testing measure. It's optional again, as we mentioned, it involves referral of the employee to a specialist centre for further tests for HAVS. The final diagnosis of HAVS still depends on the judgment of the doctor and cannot be based on these optional tests alone. The GP, the medical professional, has the final say in the matter. So your health surveillance has been carried out. We are aware of the results. Now what? When is it RIDDOR reportable? Well, firstly, you need to keep records of health surveillance and fitness for work advice provided for each employee, but not, as it states here, not the confidential medical records which are kept by the doctor. It'll be a summary. You must make the employee's records available to them so they can review the outcomes. We must, as a company, a sector, act upon any recommendations made by a doctor about employees' continued exposure to vibration. This may be limited exposure, it may be no exposure at all. However, we must take on any recommendations. Use the results to review and, if necessary, revise your risk assessment. It may include your plans to control risks. It could be task-based risk assessments on individual items of equipment. It's up to your company to review that process. And it's got to notify the relevant enforcement authority, again, the HSE, when advised in writing by the doctor. We can't just take anybody's word for it. It must be formal advice written from a doctor, receipt of a GP's diagnosis, and then we must report to RIDDOR, as it's a listed disease. And at the bottom there, the notes. Just bear in mind, health records or a copy should be kept suitable form for at least 40 years. Again, just in line with the medical records there. So managing vibration, how do we go about managing it? Well, ultimately, the control of vibration at work regs is what we work to. 2005 require to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk from vibration. There's them two key words, suitable and sufficient. This risk assessment should identify the measures that need to be taken to meet the requirements of the regulation. You should keep a record of your risk assessment, obviously. The exact content of a record of suitable and sufficient assessment will change according to your circumstances, but will contain the date of the assessment, who carried out the assessment, and will usually include at least the following. So the employee or job roles assessed. This should include the likes of the tasks, operations, and processes carried out, a description of the power tools, machines, workpieces, and potentially methods of working, how regular or how frequent the exposure of vibration is, and if the patterns change, the exposure patterns change, how they change over the weeks. So for B, the likelihood of exposure action and limit values being exceeded, we need to understand or briefly or roughly estimate the daily exposure duration associated with each piece of equipment the operatives deal with. For C, the measures you need to have put in place to control and manage the risk. Consider the measures you've already got. Potentially you may have to review them. D, a program of measures with timescales for any future controls you plan to introduce. Again, consideration of the measures likely to reduce exposure of vibration and resources required. E, appropriate information, instruction, and training, which is something we'll touch on next. F, the scheme of health surveillance in use or planned. Again, once you get involved with health surveillance, the potential is the medical professional will identify to you as the company or the individual how often your health surveillance needs to be carried out. So again, managing vibration, you should share the significant findings of your risk assessment with your exposed employees. The purpose behind that ultimately is so everyone's aware of their findings. And again, hopefully raising their awareness as to what they should be doing regarding their own control measures. Employees should be properly trained to carry out their job safely. Employers should ensure that employees fully understand the level of risk they may be exposed to, how vibration is caused, and the possible effects associated. So you can provide the information, instruction, and training, which can be informal as stated on this slide, using varied approaches, including presentations. Therefore, I don't know, you might identify the different items of work equipment and processes that could cause vibration and relevant levels that your operatives are exposed to. Computer-based training, how their personal daily exposures compare with action limit values potentially. C, the individual counselling or training could go down the likes of identifying what some sort of symptoms are associated with individuals, how they can identify hand-on vibration syndrome or carpal tunnel syndrome. Obviously, D, you've got various leaflets and posters there for identification. E, videos could include things like PPE measures potentially. F, your short local training sessions. You may be able to get some respective individuals together and discuss it in a group as to what we can do to reduce our vibration. Again, it's all about raising the awareness. And finally, toolbox talks. What we've got to bear in mind though, as employers giving this information out, employees are still expected to follow instructions given on safe working practices, report problems with their equipment, such as high levels of vibration. And we've got to get the employees to cooperate with our program of control measures and our health surveillance. That's critical to get the employee buy-in. So this example here, what we've got on the slide is some examples of exposure action values, exposure limit values against our vibration magnitudes. Now, for people that have looked into vibration before, it's quite interesting when you look at the actual vibration magnitude. And that's something that David Wadds will touch on in a bit with regard to equipment which is taken straight out of a fresh factory and tested to what the HSE have tested in real life working conditions. However, we'll have a look at this little graph here. And as you can see, the significant changes in terms of your exposure action value and your limit value. So if the exposure is likely to exceed the exposure limit value of 5, the risk is high and the vibration regulations require you to take immediate action to prevent further exposure above this level. And as you can imagine, that could be stop work with that activity, no more vibratory equipment to be used. When exposure is likely to reach or exceed the exposure action value of half of that, so 2.5, you have duties to have a formal program of measures to minimize your risk, including exposure controls, your health surveillance, and specific training. The risk must be controlled so far as is reasonably practicable at any level exposure. So even if somebody's getting low exposure levels, we still need to ensure we control our risk so far as is reasonably practicable. So your vibration, your sources of vibration magnitude, it can be provided by your manufacturers or suppliers of power tools and machinery. It's generally in your manufacturer's instructions when you get a new piece of equipment delivered to site. If you don't own your equipment, it may be hired in. Again, a lot of the hired companies now are identifying vibration or time spent on the tool as a tag. Various trade associations and others who have experience of the work processes and tools used. And the HSE may, from time to time, update or extend the range of examples. Again, David Wadds will touch on that process. But when you have obtained your vibration magnitudes for each model and item of equipment you use in your place of work, you must then work out your corresponding exposure durations for each of them. You can calculate the daily exposure for each employee, group of employees, or per the job. However, as a company, you must try and work that process out. The method of calculation vibration exposure is set out in various schedules. However, we'll touch on a few now. This one here, you may recognize from some of your training sessions you've carried out previous, triple STS, SMSTS. However, this here is called the HAVS Ready Reckoner. Now, your Ready Reckoner is a tool which you can identify how long your exposure levels are until you reach the action levels and the limit values. Again, what you've got to bear in mind with this graph is that it's a cumulative sort of effect. So if you're using, I don't know, a piece of equipment which is a vibration magnitude 4 for 30 minutes, you've got 16 points exposure, then you pick up a hammer drill, which is 14, you use that for an hour, you're starting to creep up your time there. Again, this is a bit more of a manual sort of process, and it can be quite time taking to actually work it out. The other option is your hand-arm vibration exposure calculator. Now this one here is freely available off the HSE's website. You can type in your tool or process name. In fact, it's got a drop-down box on there which has got some pre-identified items of equipment, and I'll put all the data in there for you. However, if you know your vibration magnitude for your tool, pop that in there. It will then come up with your exposure points per hour, your time to reach your exposure action value, your time to reach exposure limit value. You then put your actual exposure duration in there. So I don't know, it might be 0 hours, 42 minutes. It will then give you an identification, in terms of your total exposure points. Again, that's for one tool. If you're using 4, 5, 6 tools over an 8-hour period, you can put all that data in and it will give you a total exposure points. Very good piece of equipment. Okay, that's my part done. I'll pass you back over to David Watts.
So in terms of getting your source of vibration data, where do you get it from? Is it from, it could be from various different places. It could be from the manufacturer's website, be that Hilti. It could be from the supplier's documentation. So where have you bought it from? That might be Arco, for example. But within the guidance, it details that you should be quite cautious when identifying vibration magnitude, when you're estimating employees' vibration exposure. You need to make sure that you're careful to make sure that you're selecting a value that's representative of your work activities and it won't produce an underestimate. So key one is making sure you're not underestimating exposure. So within recent years, vibration magnitudes associated with machines, it's changed. Some have went up, some have went down. And you should try to make sure that, as far as reasonably practicable, that you're getting the most up-to-date information. And also, once you've gathered it, if you have a tool or a piece of equipment, your hammer drill, you bought that 3 or 4 years ago, you got the information off the website, check it from time to time, make sure that they do change, they do update them. And when the vibration data is collected, it's often collected for many different purposes, and sometimes it cannot be suitable for actually estimating daily vibration exposures. It might not represent the exact work that you're doing, because some of the data might have been from non-working conditions, such as idling, as part of maintenance checks, and also for actually comparing vibration emissions. So it's often collected in a lab in perfect conditions, which may not necessarily represent actual work that you're doing. So you can increase your confidence in the quality. So making sure you compare data from at least 2 sources. And if you do come across an inconsistency, question it. If you go to 2 different sources and one source says it's 9.7 meters per second squared, whereas the other one might say it's 9.5, you can have quite confidence that it's there or thereabouts. You take the higher value. However, if you do come across a massive difference, say one source says 9 and the other one says 13, I'd certainly be questioning that. Ask the question. That might be from your safety representative. It might be contacting the manufacturer and try and determine where that data was gathered from and what's it for. Is it for a hammer drill drilling into concrete? Because again, you might have a hammer, you might have a drill or an impact driver. Some of the statistics that you might gather might be for drilling into concrete. Some of it might be for drilling into metal. So again, double check that you're actually gathering the information relative for the task that you're actually doing. So but again, if you've got data from several models of machine type, it's going to be a lot more robust. If the data is from several sources, that it is shown that actually it's lower than generally expected, you can look to use that, but again, be very cautious of where this information is coming from. Is it representative of what you're doing? And that's the key point. What I would say is you should be able to find the relevant vibration information. It will depend on some of the age of some of your equipment, because again, the older drills, the older hammer drills, the hammer drill, let's say, lay in the back of the storeroom for the last 15 years, you might struggle to gather the information for something that old. However, the new stuff, you should be able to get information from the manufacturer, from the supplier, to determine the vibration of that tool. What the HSEs do say is within one of their documents is that you are likely to be able to find relevant vibration information for at least your initial assessment without the need to make measurements yourself. Because again, if you're talking about gathering measurements and gathering information for yourself, are you competent to do that? It's a difficult question to answer. But within the document, within L140, it gives an example. It has a table, and with an example of vibration magnitudes that have been measured by the HSE for tools in real world situation. So that's that table there. I will cover it. But that table one, it's giving you a summary of the vibration magnitudes for common machines. The next slide, there's two slides. I've got one for drills and one for grinders, but there is different examples. I haven't put the whole document within this spreadsheet, within this PowerPoint presentation. But I'll just do an example. So what it's doing is it's giving you where there is a close match between your machine and the vibration data. It should give you a good source of information. So within that, so say if you've got a drill bit, depending on the size of the drill bit, it also has notes. So vibration measures can depend. So the larger the drill, it's going to give a higher vibration value. But again, it details within the notes that maintaining a sharp drill bit is very important. You can get high vibrations if the operator's pushing too hard. Again, maintain a sharp bit. So worn drill bits, they're going to take longer to cut into, say, concrete. So you're going to have an increase in trigger time. Twice as long to drill, say, one hole. If you're drilling an 8mm or a 10mm hole with a blunt drill bit, and it might be taking a minute. A sharp drill bit might only take 30 seconds. So you potentially halving the actual exposure. That over many different holes could start to increase your trigger time and getting you a lot closer to the EAV or the ELV as well. So the 2.5 that Martin spoke about, and also the 5, the limit value. So pushing too hard, worn drill bit. Something else to kind of be aware of is poor maintenance. If the drills or the equipment hasn't been serviced, hasn't been assessed, it's performing poorly. Again, you could see an increase in vibration exposure because of, again, it's poorly. It might have worn bushes, it might be vibrating, something might be clunking inside. That's also going to contribute to the vibration rating of that tools. So within this, the 70, it details the lower. So when it was tested, the lower, the upper percentile, and then the recommended initial percentile, so 75%. And that's giving you a factor of safety to take into account. Another one for, say, grinders. Again, just a bit of a cut and paste out the document. So the vibration values, they're going to depend, again, how much force, what you're cutting. Make sure that if you are using an abrasive wheel, you're selecting the right abrasive wheels. You're not using a buff and trying to cut something. You're not using a grinder. You're using the correct disc for the actual task that you're doing. Because again, if you're using the right abrasive wheel, the right equipment, you're going to hopefully be you should be minimizing the exposure. And what it does say is when there's within the range, if there's a greater difference between the higher and the lower values, there's a higher likelihood in difference between machine type. So if you look at this slide, compared to say the drills were fairly close together, 2 to 5, 7 to 13. However, the difference between the grinders was a bit more of a range, a bit more of an uncertainty value. So coming on to RIDDOR Reportable, if it is diagnosed by a doctor through the Tier 4 assessment that Martin spoke about, and it becomes RIDDOR Reportable, the HSE will ask questions. They may want to take things further. It's very likely they will take things further, but these are the type of questions that they may ask, and also thinking about them, we will come back to them, but can you answer these questions? So a copy of the pre-employment screening and annual monitoring for each person's affected. Details of the health surveillance program, which identified that the person was suffering from HAVs. Because again, it's not just a case of someone reports it to you and says, oh, I've got HAVs. It's got to be a case of it's diagnosed by a medical profession. So what's the employment history? What type of vibrating equipment has been used by the person, each of the persons affected? Breakers, hammer drills, and how to think about it as well. How much was in your control and how much may have it been in previous employers, for previous employers? It's how you answer these questions, and these are the information that they're trying to gather. Because again, you might necessarily be the person who reported it, but the exposure could have been previous. How is that documented? So think as well, copy of your current and also previous policies for vibration control. The regulations have been out since 2005, so it's coming up with about 16 years. It's likely if you've had your health and safety policy reviewed, which you should be reviewed every year, but there's a very good likelihood that your vibration policy may have been updated several times over the years. Have you got copies of previous ones? Were they overwritten? Are they available on your system? Consider that as well. Copies of risk assessments. So have you risk assessed the work where workers may be exposed to vibration or likely to be undertaken as well? Especially important for handheld tools where they're going to be using them. So any relevant training records for the person affected. What have you got on file? And also, what are you going to be putting into place as in further controls? So they've been affected, they're now more susceptible to further injury. How are you going to control that moving forward? Have you got a task and equipment specific risk assessment for these affected persons? Because again, they're still employed by you, you're still managing them. So how are you going to make sure that they're not exposed to vibration further? Are you going to limit? You might look at, say, limiting, well, the limit value is 5, but actually we're going to take them, we're going to work for 2.5 for these affected persons. How are you going to manage that moving forward? And that's the questions that you potentially be asked for. So again, there was a case study, just a bit of a case study from a company. It's on the HSE's website, it was recent. So a company, they'll find £600,000 after appeals, after 5 employees developed hand-on vibration. So the company was using vibrating power tools to carry out ground maintenance tasks. And from that, the HSE found that when they reported the HAVs, that they failed to provide suitable training, suitable health surveillance, and failed to maintain and replace tools which increased vibrations limit. So again, there was old equipment that was potentially damaged and they weren't replaced. So again, these are what were being looked at. So the fines, again, are based on company's turnover. So it's the starting point of the fine was pointing at £1 million. From that, the judge deemed that as there were more than one employee harmed this way. That's again an aggravating factor in setting the starting point of the fine. Their turnover was 350 million. So again, it was deemed that the company was a very large organisation as defined by the sentencing guidelines. So again, anything more than 50 million is defined as a very large organisation. So again, the fines increased to 2 million. However, there were several, again, judges looking at other factors as well. It's not just all hammered down, and it was also, they had a good safety record and an early guilty plea and good cooperation through the investigation, and therefore reduced the fine to 1.25 million. However, as they weren't a not-for-profit organisation, the judge took a step back view and further reduced the fine to 600,000. It was then that which was then appeal. The main issue for the Court of Appeal was the VLO status of the company. The judge deemed it appropriate to increase the fine from 1 to 2 million as a starting point, taking it potentially above the starting point for the top of the range offence categorisation. The appeal judge also linked the company to a charity and felt that it was excessive to the ultimate beneficiaries. So that Court of Appeal reduced the fine to £400,000. Still a massive amount. They didn't provide any further guidance of when the VLO should be triggered. However, it did clearly support the principle that the starting fine should be increased to reflect the substantial means of the defendant. So think about it for yourselves as your organisation. You are managing how you manage vibration within your workplace. Do you have the information below? Do you have copies? Do you have copies of pre-employment screening? Do you have annual monitoring for each of the persons affected? How are you dealing with that? So again, are you covering with all staff using tools? You may not have it for long-term staff. You might have people who've been working for your company for 25, 30 years. It's very unlikely you'd have had a pre-employment medical then. However, for them, it's a case of this is the starting point. This is when we started doing medicals, and it's a case of they're being picked up, and then new employees as they come into your organisation. Details of what is this health surveillance program? Is it a case of we do a tier 1 assessment at first start, tier 2s every year, and then medical screening for all of your staff, possibly some of your staff that are using tools? What is your health surveillance program? Because again, you'll all know that actually some sites that we're starting to work on, they're starting to demand it. They're just demanding health surveillance. Do you have that? So again, you might have already been doing it because it might have been pushed by a principal contractor that you work for. But again, it's becoming more popular. And what I would always say is the big players, the big companies, they're pushing it. And it's very likely, I would say, that it'll start to trickle down to, say, the smaller organisations. So what is the employment history? So because again, you might be employing somebody in a trade where they might not be actually exposed to a massive amount of vibration because of what they do. What was their previous employment history? Have they always worked for you? And were they, say, potentially doing different tasks? Were they using a breaker for you in a different role 10 years ago? Or did they even work for another company? Again, you might be picking up people that start your organisation and they might have existing conditions. So again, just think about it with this health surveillance program. You pick it up for somebody who starts for you tomorrow. You bring somebody in, they're starting tomorrow. You do medical screening and you pick up straight away that they've got halves. Again, it's gonna be quite useful for your defence that you've picked it up that early to say, well, actually, yes, he works for me now. It's reportable. However, it's a good way to defend it to say, well, it started last week. So think about that in terms of health surveillance. It can be very useful for defending yourself as well. It does open a can of worms and you will pick things up, but it's then how you're going to manage it moving forwards. So do you have copies of your current and previous policies for vibration control? Can you put the hand on them? If you are doing vibration control, you are monitoring them. What happens to them at the end of the job? Are they kept in the site file? Is that then brought back? Because remember, going back to the 40 years for records, can you put your hand on them? Can you bring them out? So yes, we're doing vibration monitoring. We did it all on the sites, but if you can't get a hold of it, you haven't got it, you've lost it, it's went in the bin, it's going to be very difficult for you again to manage it that way. What training records have you got? So do they know? Have they been trained? So does the person who's using this hammer drill or that breaker, etc., or that grinder, do they know what the vibration rating is? What is the trigger time for it? So that's a question that you might be asked. So if you've got somebody using a breaker, can you go up to them on site and say, how long can you use that breaker for? Can they answer you? If they turn around and say, well, I know I can use it for 35 minutes and I've used it for 20 so far, well, that's very good. However, if they turn around and say, well, I don't know, I've never been told, again, have you provided them with suitable training? And again, if you've got people who say started for your organization, you've picked up, there's control, what are the control measures? How are you going to manage them moving forwards? And that's what we're kind of looking at as well. And also, what I would always say is, in terms of maintenance of tools, in terms of equipment, look at it as well as in terms of adapt to technological advances. Similar, if you go buy a brand new hammer drill or brand new tool today, you can have a good idea. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't, but the vibration rating for it is likely to be a lot lower than, say, a tool from 10 years ago. So again, adapting to technological advancements, but also there's some very good kit out there that actually has removed vibration ratings. So you know the standard whacker plates that you say the ground workers using on site. Someone holding that's a massive amount of hand-on vibration they are being exposed to. But now you see on site, you've got remote control ones. Have you adapted to technological advancement? So those are remote control ones. What's the vibration of a remote control whacker plate? 0, because the person isn't holding it. He's standing 5 meters away from it. He's also exposed to less noise, which tends to go hand in hand with vibration. So consider that as well. Making sure you're servicing equipment, making sure when items break are either being repaired or replaced. So, very brief one, but how can you comply moving forward? Pre-employment screening and annual monitoring is key to help and manage hand-on vibration. And that forms part of your health surveillance program. And that's going to be risk assessed for different members of staff. What are some, because again, you might have a team of 20, 50 people. Some of them will be exposed more than others. So how are you targeting that? How are you managing that? How are you monitoring the vibratory equipment that is being used by members of your staff? And again, touching back to what I said, a lot of companies might monitor it and have very good records on site, but what's happening with them at the end of site? Are they coming back? Are they being filed correctly? Can you pick them up in 10 years' time when if you had an incident or had a RIDDOR? Can you got the access to that? Risk assessments for the work undertaken or likely to be undertaken, specifically considering the exposure for these handheld tools that they're using. Relevance to training for your staff. Do they know what the trigger time of the equipment they are using? It's a question. Try it next time you're on site. If you've got policies, procedures, you're detailing it with your risk assessments, you're walking around site, you see somebody with, say something, a breaker, ask them a question. Do they know how long they can use it for? Because often they might not be aware of it, but that's for yourselves, making sure that you're training your staff. And again, if you've got existing conditions, somebody has halves already, you've reported it, it's been managed. What are your control measures? Are you going to, you've got to be thinking about things like reducing their exposure further to make sure it isn't being made worse. So in terms of the key message to kind of take away from today, halves, it is preventable. but once the damage is done, it is permanent. It's a chronic disease. It's serious. It's debilitating, and nearly 2 million people are at risk. People who are using hand tools and equipment on wind construction, in civil engineering, they are at risk. It also affects intricate tasks. So again, they might need little fingers to do fine work. So things like if you're an electrician terminating into boards, you're losing dexterity, but that's going to affect people at home as well. It's not just at work. And again, the more susceptible to the cold, the more susceptible to this when it's cold weather, because again, the cold can trigger painful finger bandaging attacks. They lose the dexterity even more so in the cold. The cost to employees and employers of inaction can be high. So again, if you've got a large amount of cases, it's how you manage it. The cost to employees, you know, it's the fingers, it's the hands, it's their ability to do certain tasks. They're going to struggle, but also, why are they struggling? What have they been exposed to over the years? And there are simple and cost-effective ways to eliminate risk. It is preventable. It's a key message. How you prevent it is you control an exposure, you ensuring you've got tools and equipment that are in good condition. They're being you're monitoring it, and that's what the regulations focus on. Can you eliminate it? So things like remote control equipment, if possible, breakers. I've seen some pretty impressive stuff in the demolition world, but also ground workers using these wire plates. And that's what it's doing, is it's helping eliminate and control vibration exposure. Again, the long-term aim of this is we want to prevent new cases of HAVs occurring, making sure that we enable workers to remain at work without a disability, because it is a big issue for the industry. The most efficient and effective way of controlling exposure is to look for new and alternative methods. So adaptive technology. So often you'll see on sites now, the shot fired guns, again, they're massively lower in terms of vibration than, say, a hammer drill. Also, that's like an alternative work methods. Can we get things delivered to site the correct size, so we're not having to cut things with still saws, grinders and things like that? But the key one as well is health surveillance. It's vital to detect, because again, if it's detected early and you respond to early signs of damage, you can help massively and reduce the long-term effect of the disease for your employees. And that's the end. So what we'll do is, if anybody's got any questions, if you want to raise your hand on Zoom, metaphorically speaking, and we'll try and answer any queries people have got. If not, if you've got any queries, you can also just email info@carneyconsultancy.co.uk if you've got any queries or you've got any questions. So yeah, I'll just look to see if anybody's. I can see people are starting to kind of drop off, which is fine. Awesome. I've had one question came in on the chat box. Can we recommend any tools to measure real-time vibration while using tools? There is certain tools that are available. That it's like a wrist kind of strap. I have seen some technology out there. It is quite good. And it's like it acts as like a wrist strap, and it'll record things, and people have to clock in and clock out. It is expensive, I'm not going to lie. We did get involved in getting a quote for a company, but how it works is effectively it's like a wrist strap that they can sign in to. It monitors their exposure, and it's like a live monitoring, and that's how that would work. Once they put it back in the docking station, it effectively records it, and it's recorded onto a server system. It's called React Tech. I'll be honest, I've never used it, so I can't recommend it. but if that's what you were looking for, that would be something to potentially look for. But I can't recommend it in terms of, I've never used it, I've never seen it work, and I've never had experience. I have had a talk from a sales advisor for it, but that's something to potentially look at.
Anything else?
Anything else?
No.
Oh, well, thank you everybody for your time. I hope you found it useful. But again, if you have got any other questions, please just drop me an email. And we hope to see you in person at Working Well Together events in the future. Thank you.